Hello, and thank you everyone that watched the Arno video and gave on Patreon. Obviously, it keeps the lights going and it keeps everything doing, and there aren't that many lights here to begin with. But I thought instead of just ending it there, I'd do another video this month. I usually do in December kind of like a animation studio run through, and it wasn't really very practical this year considering how long I was working on the other project and just energy wise, but I had a good idea of doing something I used to see a lot when I was a kid. So when I was younger, they used to have these books that were like 100,000, I don't know, anime that you should watch before you die. It would be like 100 anime, 200 anime. I remember seeing those back then, and I was like, oh, that's actually kind of a really interesting idea. I don't know if I ever picked any of them up, but I want to kind of do my own thing here. So we're going to do 100 anime films, and it's going to be done in a very specific way. So I'm going to block this video in time code. So we're going to start in the 60s, we'll go through 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and then I'll have some special categories. I feel like there's a lot of videos or movies that have been talked to death. So they're going to go in what I call the classics area, which will be right at the end. That's where we get the watch time, right? So if you want to see all those, you go to you got to wait for it. But that's where I'm going to fast forward through a lot of the sort of ones that you usually hear. But also just before then, I'm going to talk about more sort of art house experimental stuff, which isn't necessarily like a full theatrical film, but there can be a couple in there, but just something a bit more out there. If you're looking for something kind of a little bit different. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of a technicality. So usually anime was kind of coined in that 60s period. We could look at Astro Boy, right? But there is a lot of animation history in Japan that goes way before then. And it's going to be a bit hard for me to even cover any of that here. Some of it's not very easy to get to, etc., etc. So first things first, though, I'm probably going to talk about Noboru Ofuji, who was one of the pioneers of animation in Japan. And so much so, basically they named a whole animation award after him, and a lot of entries that won awards will actually be on this list too. But yeah, you can actually see a lot of this work quite easy, let's say. I mean, there's a lot of it on the Japanese archive. Fuji basically tried most, if any, type of animation he could get his hands on. So we're going to start with what in the English realm is usually called The Little Prince and the Eight-Headed Dragon. It inspired a lot of stuff. It has a kind of clean modernist design, and you'll see that in Samurai Jack, you'll see it in Wind Waker, you'll see it in Irish animation from Cartoon Saloon. So it's definitely had a wide spread of it, but it's really quite unique in this era of Toei animation. So Toei started, and sometimes this term came around Disney of the East. That's kind of what they were pitching at. They did a lot of sort of different myths from different countries in full theatrical form. And this one changed the mold a bit with a very different sort of style and execution. And some of it is just top line stuff when it comes to its set pieces. That's really what makes it excel. Back when I made videos on this topic, they effectively didn't have very good sources. If you were lucky, you could find maybe a Japanese DVD hard to get your hands on. But luckily, about 2 years ago, there was a Japanese Blu-ray. So there was a 4K sort of restoration of it. And yeah, it looks great now, even more so. When you see things like the Orochi sequence, it is absolutely crazy. And this dance sequence, which took so much effort. So that's a very striking kind of story by the end of it. Definitely a little bit more mature than some of the other Toei stuff at this time. I would totally check it out. So we're going to jump forward a bit into the Toei sphere and go all the way to 1968. Now, throughout those years of Toei, which started about a decade before this point, you're going to see a lot of movies that have musical numbers, and they kind of play to a sort of, family audience, a lot of sort of playful extra sort of characters and all this. But this one starts to change the levels a bit. In fact, I think it got a bit of an older audience, and it is also Isao Takahata's directorial debut. And again, I think this is the first video I made about anime on this channel, was on the topic of this. I believe when I made that video, they just released the Blu-ray in America. It's probably the best way of seeing it. Also, I think you can now stream it. So it's actually one of the most easily available these films. But yeah, it is pretty much a proof of concept of the style of pictures that Miyazaki would continue to make. Even though it's not his film, he was pretty involved creatively You'll see a couple cuts from him, but pretty much all the golden childs of Toei were really firing out. Even though it's rougher around the edges and stuff, I think that makes it kind of more interesting. And there are some sequences in here, like the fight against the fish, that are really just still to this day jaw-droppingly impressive. But it definitely had some more ambitious themes about collective unity. It's coming during the period where like Toei was getting unionized. A lot of themes are sort of going towards like leftist politics as well. And yeah, I think this one is definitely one pretty cool thing. So after there was like a really stressful period trying to make that film, a lot of Toei people wanted to blow off some steam, so they made this film instead, which is The Wonderful World of Puss in Boots. It's quite fun. It's definitely more like a Warner Brothers sort of cartoon. You have sort of more like playful cat characters. There's a couple minor musical numbers, but nothing too much. But really the place where this sort of goes off, let's say, is right at the end. Like the last third of it is just one crazy animation sequence, which became like the cornerstone for movies like Castle of Cagliostro. They used that same sort of template in the ending with the crazy castle stuff. Lucky as well, like if you can find it, Puss in Boots also got itself a Blu-ray release very recently. Before then, I think you could really only find like probably like bootlegs of maybe on DVD, which might have been like cropped to 4:3, or maybe you find like dodgy versions on streaming sites. Now I'm pretty sure you can, if you have access to it, you can use like Japanese Amazon to rent it, or you can try and find a rip of the original film like that. There was an original dub somewhere as well, but I don't think that's obviously transferred over. Maybe one day there'll be an official release in the West, but I don't know about that. Pero, the main character, you may recognize him because he became basically the mascot for Toei to this day. And they haven't really done that many movies since. Like during the 60s and 70s, they did a couple films with him. I heard there was a short that came out fairly recently. I didn't get to see, unfortunately. But yeah, I'd kind of be interested to see him come back because as they showed, like you can kind of just put him in any situation and just go with it, really. So yeah, more Pero, please. All right, now we move to the 70s, and the 70s, it's a bit of a transition period. During the 60s, we're kind of majorly two companies that were mostly doing stuff. That's going to be Mushi Pro, and we'll get back to them later, and Toei. But now we're in the 70s, things are going to start expanding out a little bit. And first off, let's start back where we were a second ago. Now, if you like Puss in Boots, but you're looking for something a little bit more swashbuckly, maybe, I don't know, you can play with Animal Treasure Island. Now, this one also had a lot of Miyazaki contributions. He wasn't the director, but he did make a manga for it. He did like a lot of like the major sort of more playful cuts. Like he was definitely sort of becoming more of his own at that period. But everyone who was working on it from the classic Toei era, including people like Kotabe, did really great work on this film. One of the other fun things you might notice is it's probably maybe the first interaction of a kind of Miyazaki girl character who was just added to the story, I guess because they wanted it, right? But she's pretty hardcore. Also, yeah, you kind of notice that a lot of that sort of more playful energy when it comes to chases and energy sort of transfers after this period into the Lupin franchise, especially when Miyazaki's really taking hold with Takahata, so, Cagliostro, or some of his episodes in Lupin 2. So if you're into that kind of energy, this is a good one to check out. So now for something also from Toei, but a little bit different. This is a little more understated and mythical. You could look at it a bit more like an ukiyo painting in the backdrop, a little bit more rustic too, and it is quite unapologetically strange at times. And I think that definitely comes from its origins. Like it can be quite scary, it has almost full-on nudity at times, but it can also be joyful and fun, and I think that's accentuated in clips like the sumo wrestling with a bear. Now, Reiko Okayama being pretty strong in defining the visual style of the film, it might be fitting. I mean, she is almost a legend in this case. Not only do they make a whole television show about like loosely based on her history. She was basically the first animation director who was a woman in Japan, maybe, at least at Toei. And you can kind of look at Terry the Dragon Boy as almost like a last hurrah from that sort of early era where it was defined more by this sort of group of very creative and talented animators who were all still at the company. Slowly they all basically left, and this might be the last time you get that sort of feeling from Toei's original crop of animations before they sort of move into a kind of a different direction, which goes more towards the popularity that you might see that starts with the movies of Battleship Yamato. Now, moving on to, of course, if we're going to talk about Battleship Yamato, response to that, we have the theatrical film of Galaxy Express 39. And yeah, it's definitely like a visual treat. I mean, if you don't want to watch 113 episodes, I think it does a pretty good job of condensing that general story all together. It also could be a pretty good intro to Leiji Matsumoto's universe of characters because they sort of intertwine a lot, and you actually see a fair couple of them in this movie itself. And you can't really talk about 39 here without mentioning maybe some of the animation cuts in here were very influential, especially when it came from Canada, who you might see here doing some of the explosions and dragon shots in here, which became like paramount. A whole generation of like animators may have been inspired to join the industry from just this film alone. But yeah, it's a fun romp. It's from Rintaro, who will be on this list lots, let's put it that way. And I think it does also show an interesting sort of version of the future, almost, you know, a little preemptively towards sort of more sci-fi works we're about to see in the 80s, but it sort of established a lot of those tones, a very neon, futuristic space age. All right, speaking of people who are going to be on the list probably a fair bit, we have to talk about a completely different company now for once. We're going to go to TMS. Shoujo, Tennis, Superstar, Aim for the Ace. The movie is really great. It actually has a quite different style. It sort of is kind of on the cusp of the 80s, and there's a lot more sort of references to that. You know, we see arcades, almost like the era changes, high contrast sort of elements. You're going to lose something, obviously, in condensing a story which at first, at least in this section of the story, would have been like 26 episodes, and now it's a feature film. It hits. The way it tells the story is great. The visuals it uses are amazing, especially towards the end. I think it actually surpasses the original version in the ending. The final tennis match is absolutely astounding. Like, it is primal. It almost feels like the universe is starting again. The way it spins around, the colors, everything comes together in a much more dramatic way than it does in the original series. That would probably be one of my minor critiques of the original show. It's just the ending doesn't really feel as earned, maybe as it does in the movie. Yeah, I think this is maybe Saki's best movie, and probably my favorite, maybe my favorite of the 70s. So, Ringing Bell. Now, this is another time. We're going to Sanrio now. This one, quite different from what we got before. It's pretty bleak in a very sort of slow, sad way. I mean, I wouldn't say it's like Watership Down. You know, if you're English, you've all seen Watership Down. That's traumatic. This is kind of different than that. But the way it is sad and horrible is really interesting, actually. A wolf kind of murders their parents, and they are left with nothing in this life but vengeance, which is very tuny, I know. But the way it's executed is pretty solid. In fact, one of the scenes that really accentuates that for me is a moment where, like, Ringing Bell tries to save a bird's nest in a way. Like, he's trying to stop sort of another creature coming in, just destroying a family. But in the process, all the eggs just crack, smash on the floor. It sort of just accentuates, like, just the brutality of nature and, like, the food chain. Because ultimately, you know, nothing personal here. Like, the wolf that did this just did it because, you know, if the wolf doesn't eat, it doesn't survive, and that is just like how it is. But, you know, Ringing Bell is just so dead set on, like, no, I'm gonna kill this wolf. I'm gonna do that. That he ends up spending like half his life just learning from the wolf how to kill it in a weird cynical way. But yeah, I think it's interesting to see a film like this that's about trauma for children. And how that comes, because it's kind of towards the end, the way this all plays out, you know, obviously when it comes to vengeance and kids film, it doesn't end well for Ringing Bell. It's kind of a little bit He gets the rawest deal ever because not only does he lose his original family, he then loses his surrogate family, and then when he ends back in the pen where all the other sheep are, he's basically lived such a different life than them that none of them recognize him, and he to them is a scary threat. He can't really go back to that life, and realistically, if he goes back to that life, the only thing waiting for him is murder anyway. He's going to be killed and fed to someone else. So yeah, if you're looking for a bleak time, try Ringing Bell. Speaking of Sanrio, now we're going into the 80s, and we're going to look at Ringing Bell's, maybe you could say a follow-up to it in a way. It's a little bit different this time though, because we are now looking at Unico, which was originally a story penned by Osamu Tezuka, and this is animated by Tezuka Productions and Madhouse together. It is a very gothic film at times. Like, it's really striking visually. Like, the backgrounds are beautifully painted, and the animation is pretty sharp too. But it is again a very sad story about the helplessness of being a small little creature. This one kind of has a weird sort of Greek myth tinge to it, and generally, yeah, like you sort of see Unico lose everything, fall down, do this, and you think it's gonna be triumphant, but it ain't a triumphant story in the end, I'm afraid. And the way it ends, I think, is one of the more interesting sort of twists on this. Like, it should be a happy ending, but it is not. It is not. But in a way that will leave an impact on you, sort of like a hole in your gut. Oh yeah, if you like this one too, bonus points, there is a second film made at Madhouse, which is also pretty cool. Probably more like action based. It has like a really more so like unified narrative towards this one big event, where the first one I think is a little bit more character based. Do you know what a mecha is? Well, this one on the cusp of the 80s is the trilogy, 3 films of Gundam. Now this is kind of a recut. This is something you'll see a lot during this period, is these sort of recut movies where they take shows and they turn them into movies. I think with Gundam, it's maybe more merited in some ways because the original sort of production, was cut short, so there's some new scenes towards especially the third movie. And obviously the original series is quite long, so like if you're not feeling watching the whole entire series, you get the general sort of story event from here, which is 3 movies, much more digestible, I suppose. And yeah, there's definitely some stuff in there which you won't see in the original series as well. And it really sort of highlights in that this sort of relationship between Shah and Amuro, and there's some stuff that really holds up really good. Really interesting characterization on both Sion and the Alliance side. The sort of politics of the world is pretty cool. And it also gets to highlight just how many people just die in Tomino shows, which that's always fun to see. Really, like no one is safe sometimes. But yeah, if you want to be introduced to the world of Gundam, I think this is a really solid place to start in that the universal timeline. But it is also quite easy to find nowadays. I believe you may even be able to get it on YouTube, because Gundam has their own channel, but sometimes they put stuff on like there. I think it was sent to Netflix too. It's definitely the easiest it's ever been to watch these films. All right, now we're talking about Gauche, the celloist. This is kind of like a smaller production from Takahata, and I'm going to try not to repeat the same directors a ton, but I think this one is unique enough and interesting that it should be talked about, because it's sort of an adaptation of like a smaller short story, but I think there's a lot of play here in terms of animation style and visual, iconography, and if you're into sort of animations about music, this one is really fun. I think everyone should give it a go, really. It's got a real rhythm to it that ultimately comes together in a really great musical performance towards the end. Do you like atomic bombs? Do you like the horrors of war? Then I got a good one for you, Barefoot Gen. It's a great manga series too, but I think the movie is pretty solid in terms of like a visual version of that. The original manga is set in like a very 70s sort of almost flat style at times. It's very set in its panel layout. But the movie can really explore more of the horrors of the situation, especially towards like the, I guess the draw of Barefoot Gen. I think it's this early part of the story where it's like, whoa, you're seeing Hiroshima really get wiped in brutally historic fashion. And at first I was kind of wondering how much like artistic license they were taking on that. But if you look at like the Hiroshima Museum, like it's pretty accurate, despite it being about a really terrible event and trying to survive it, which I think makes it quite compelling. It's a film that's really dictated on like just the hope of surviving, just of keeping going. But yeah, I mean, I think the main draw for a lot of people for Battlefield again is just the horrific war scenes of the bomb and how it is contrasted with the movie beforehand, which pretty much just a slice of life story about a family, and you kind of just got to see how that was going. And there's some sort of struggles in terms of like the inner politics. But yeah, it just it really takes a U-turn when the thing that has to happen happens. It's full on Miyazaki time now. We've got to talk about Nausicaa. Nausicaa is a bop. I won't have any one tell me it's not. I once called it a magnum opus. You can watch that video of some, maybe it's over here. You gotta see that stuff. But what I think is interesting about Nausicaa is just that the madman actually did it, right? He actually ended up adapting it himself, which I think was pretty novel at the time. And maybe this is where that idea of like auteur master sort of control sort of comes in, and that's maybe not the greatest thing overall, but because that's like Suzuki's sort of game here, like the idea of like the only way you can get a great adaptation comes from the original creator's mind. It just so it's lucky that Miyazaki was more of an animator to be an animation director at that point than he was a mangaka anyway, but it was pretty successful. And I think to me, some of the qualities I really like about the movie is how it differs from his later work. That it is set in a post-apocalyptic world that is inherently very bleak. The musical tracks, which do come from Joe Hisaishi, they feel different because they're definitely more in his synth era, so they have a more that sort of feel to them, which I think makes the whole movie feel different in itself. The sort of palette, the color palette of the sort of fungal forests that you spend a lot of time in is particularly unique and interesting. A little bit more towards like the Mobius aesthetic, because the way the manga is set up, because of it being quite small in its panels, and that's an intention of the director, you don't really get to feel the environment as much. You don't get to sort of breathe it in. Especially since, not only are the panels quite small, you only see it in sort of like carvings of the backdrops. But the movie, you really get to live that world, and that's really engaging. It's not as polished as some of his later stuff, which again I think that's pretty interesting because you get to see a lot more of the creative design language of the different animators who worked on it. A lot less time to correct stuff. So when Canada is on display, again, showers to Canada, it's just Canada. Like it's just full on. Like going from this more maybe naturalistic Miyazaki style to really going into a very stylish approach to animation. Yeah, I think it was definitely a risky film to be made at the time, but it came through at a period maybe just at the right moment, especially in its sort of apocalyptic sort of energy, reflective of its era. That it became quite successful for a film that effectively, didn't have a huge franchise behind it. It had a manga prior, which is the only reason it even got made. But it made more money than I think they could have possibly expected at that time period. And if you look at the sort of rates of like video sales during that period, 84 is like a real boot, like really upturn. And I think Nausicaa is definitely a sign for that. And of what you'll see later, whereas you tend to see other companies go, oh, we should totally get mangakas to direct movies. That seems to actually work. People seem to be buying that. So yeah, it may have shaped a little bit of the direction that came later. The shape of manga adaptation movies to come, including speaking of which, Royal Space Force. It's a little bit different than some of the other sci-fi stuff we're going to talk about. Like the 80s is just full of like sci-fi works, but this one is a lot more grounded, sort of a more naturalistic slow burn and full of a kind of like middle class just disconnection with the world. A lot of like, the world is shit right now, but what the fuck are we doing? Like the whole premise of the movie being like just to go into space while this actual terrible political war's happening, it kind of feels trivial, and yet the team is still doing it, and it's kind of seen as just like a bunch of like rejects effectively that couldn't go anywhere else, and they're stuck in this world and they're just kind of like cruising on by. And maybe that's what makes it interesting in terms of like they chose the ultimate slacker protagonist to then actually decide to start giving a fuck. A lot of the movie comes down to the vibe of the characters being pretty fun. The main guy, a little all over the place in terms of characterization, but nonetheless, the music, the animation, the aesthetic all come together in a really fulfilling way, just to sort of relax within, like you're sort of like just swimming in it. And some of that music comes from Ryuichi Sakamoto of Yellow Magic Orchestra fame. Maybe not all of it necessarily, but his name was definitely a selling point, I think, at the time. You know, they'd done something similar for Nausicaa. Nausicaa had gotten Hosono, as like Harry Hosono, to do, I think, the ending theme. So I think Bandai at the time was like, well, we need someone to, we need some element as well to keep this going. But yeah, generally when it comes to like the actual technical side of like the rockets and the planes, this stuff is pretty amazing, especially the space stuff, which some of it was done by Arno, probably some of his best work as an animator, technically. And you know, as the boomers say, they don't make them like this anymore, and there's a good reason for it, because Royal Space Force wasn't exactly like a super hit or anything. I mean, it was kind of slow burn, kind of like break even kind of point. I don't think it was the massive success they were maybe hoping for post like Nausicaa. You know, it wasn't Akira basically, but it's still worth checking out nonetheless. Now, following on from Royal Space Force, obviously didn't do the greatest, but you know what did? Eiko. Project Eiko was kind of a reaction to, at the time, at least what some have said, is like, this is what anime fans really want. You know, you've got these girls, a lot of playful energy in them, some of them half naked, with robot parts, going into space, fighting rockets, doing action scenes, and this in itself, a little bit of a parody. You know, at that time especially, you'll see highlights all over the 80s of animation referenced in this film. But as an actual film, it does stand up on its own. It has a lot of great, like, action animators in it, and just really likable to, like, sort of main cast in terms of like the two girls. You know, just sort of like hanging out with them is just cool. One of the sort of like benefits of that is that Eiko can start really small. You know, it's late for school, and at the end of the film, it's basically like, oh, intergalactic sort of space war, but still, you know, afterwards it's like, yeah, okay, well, back to school now. You know, whatever. Shrug. That was just another day in the life of you know, Eiko and Biko and Seiko. But recently, I think Project Eiko was remastered, so there's like a really nice original sort of master of the film came in, really sharp looking version, which you can probably find. I'm assuming it was another discotheque thing. I have no idea if it's available anywhere else, but yeah, it's definitely a fun little picture. All right, Fist for North Star, one word: acupuncture kung fu, knock someone's head off. Enough said. The Star of Cottonland. Now, this is fascinating for a couple reasons. This is a shoujo adaptation about a kitten that looks like almost like a Victorian little girl with the cat ears, and may be the popularization or the popularizer of the cat maid and cat girl sort of template. It's probably not what you expected that to come from, but yeah, it's actually quite a fascinating, because at first it seems like it's pretty cute. I mean, there's a couple sad moments, but it's kind of a cute sort of more slice of life thing, but then it becomes basically a journey to find meaning in life, when the main character realizes they aren't human, and they're trying to then find meaning as a cat, which is a whole completely different other thing. And it comes from the resurrected studio of Mushi Pro. Original Mushi Pro from Tezuka sort of the kind of crash and burn in about 73. A lot of those staff members then ended up going into the industry and doing different things. But then eventually somewhere in the 80s, as we've seen here with like Unico, that was like a new era of Tezuka's productions. You know, if it sounds up your alley, give it a go. Now, Project Eiko kind of responds to what you might see in something like here, which is Project Eden with Dirty Pair, like the sort of playful misadventures of two rogue sort of characters in space. Project Eden in particular has what I would call the city pop future funk flair. There's just a couple of cuts in here I'm like, yeah, instantly like, yeah, I know. that's the style, because there's just a ton of like just musical numbers, almost just like AMVs within the movie, where things are just like, yeah, we're gonna vibe. Yes, this is the neon future 80s, and we're having a great time. And yes, this is also kind of Aliens, but not. Something you see a lot in this era, I think, is just the James Bond kind of approach, where there's just like an opening, which is like, okay, we're just gonna do Bond. And generally done pretty solid. I mean, animation, you don't have the limits of anything live action, so I think they can really play into those tropes that you see in those openings in their own way. Yeah, I think one aspect that makes Eden a little bit different than maybe before is that they have this sort of off-brand city hunter Lupin guy that sort of brings into the adventure. So it becomes more of a trio versus aliens than it is just like the girls. And that's the different dynamic than... I think it adds a little bit more dynamic to the whole event. Just pretty absurd, to be honest, especially the ending. And speaking of like just absurdity, weirdness in the sort of 80s neon glow. I think it's an Aishi production. It's kind of one where, yeah, you got to see to believe. And if you like those kind of, if you like the kind of visuals you see in the video, you're probably going to enjoy the experience. A lot of Kira kind of elements in there, and that, like, you know, you got bikes and you have people with psychic powers, but they take it like one step up into like a completely different realm at times with what they're doing with that. Especially when they start getting chased by giant heads. Well, if we're going to mention Gundam, I should probably mention Macross, right? Now, Macross, Do You Remember Love also suffers from some of the, like, just trying to contain a story that's much larger into a shorter fashion. And I think this is more predominant in Macross because it's one movie, instead of, like, three. But what it really does accomplish in its first half, especially, just like the height of the 80s, I would like to say almost OVA sort of era like level kind of aesthetic, but obviously it's a movie. Very dark, a lot of like strong black backgrounds from space. You've got a lot of effects animation like backlighting on top. You have tons of layers of like shading on the characters, just like visually going mad, especially when it comes to like aerial fights and stuff, and the sort of techniques they're using. And I know that it's really impressive what they were even able to sort of accomplish, because I think a lot of scenes were cut from this movie. The deadline was just suddenly like moved forward out of nowhere, so that it looks as great as it does and it works at all is kind of a miracle. But yeah, if you kind of want to be introduced to the world of Macross, this might be a fun place to start, because idols, space, kind of beginning of the era where like I think they actually use, if I remember right, the word otaku is actually in Macross. I think that's probably the first anime to actually use it as a concept. But yeah, it's the intersection between idol culture and mechas. Time estrangers, I think they call this. As far as I understand, you don't really need to have seen the original series at all. It's kind of set like way in the future, in a way where like these characters have basically lived their heroic life in that period. That time's gone. They are now older, they are retired effectively, they are trying to live a normal life, and this was a kind of anniversary. One event happens where the main character gets in some trouble, and the whole movie kind of unfurls from there, and you see a lot. Basically, it's a character study into her life, and you kind of experience it all through her. That's quite existential about this, about like Remy's life, which is at times pretty brutal. Just the idea of like, what does a soldier do when they're done? Like, where's meaning in life at that point? Especially when they sort of not only contrast the current day with basically what was their last mission, like the last time they really were in a situation together, and them sort of remembering that, like, basically this hopeless situation that seemed like it was no way out. Yeah, and I guess the funny thing here, I believe this is the person that would go on to be the Pokemon director doing this. And what really, I think, sells it is that Remy is just badass. Right, so anthology films. So that kind of starts to get a bit more popular towards the 80s. And from what I understand, usually these sort of anthology films were basically, I don't know, like, it's basically like a demo for like a film reel even, of like, this is what we as a studio can do. This is the power of our studio. And that's what you see with Neo Tokyo, which is Madhouse being like, yeah, this is us. This is how cool we are. Right? You see this? This is right. And you get some crazy stuff in here. Like we bring in Kawajiri. This is one of his more early sort of ventures into sort of really letting go with his team in terms of like just like bleak, futuristic, dystopian worlds, and it's probably one of his most raw pieces. And then of course you've got Rintaro again. He brings out like a really abstract sort of surreal number, which is really cool. And you also get Otomo's director debut here. I think it's probably the weakest of the three, but it's still a very interesting, a lot of fun number, which feels a bit more like an adaptation of one of his mangas, but it's pretty solid for going in straight away. It's definitely one of the best anthologies in terms of like that, but we're going to see a fair few of them on the list, so, you know, best of a good bunch, let's say. I think what's great about it is really just that each of them are really distinct and different from each other, and all show off different styles of animation too, which I think that's a cool thing to see. Phoenix Karma, we're talking about Tezuka, another Tezuka adaptation from Rintaro. This is based on what might be the most popular element. I think it's like chapter 4 of Phoenix. Phoenix is a very long run, like basically the life's work of Tezuka, the thing he was really working to finish, never quite did. Actually, I think they're making a new adaptation now quite soon from 4C. So I'm looking forward to that. But this one is really, really solid. I mean, I definitely think it's worth reading because you get there's more to the story. But I think what they did in this version is like really good beats for it, the way it tells the story, gets everything across it needs to. Just kind of like a beautiful little story about like a craftsman and a bandit, and how a bandit eventually becomes a monk. Yeah, I think the little stories it tells and how everything unfolds is really worth seeing. I mean, Rintaro used to work at Mushi Pro too, so like, you know, at this point I think Tezuka's still going, but like, yeah, he's been working with Tezuka for absolutely decades. Definitely decades at that point. So like, yeah, he's definitely like the right choice for it. I think he definitely knew, like, you know, the style of adaptation, like how to adapt a Tezuka story basically in its own way, especially because the manga I think is a little bit more surrealist and has a real rhythm to its imagery, and I think that Rintaro was going for a kind of different approach, but one that I think works for its own right in animation. All right, before I repeat myself, we got another story about outlaws and the future, and they might be bounty hunters maybe, or just sort of people that don't live on the side of the law. And yeah, it's kind of a little bit like Blade Runner, you know, in space. But I think what makes this come together as something that stands out is that like the narrative here doesn't really matter as much. It's a bit more experiential. Like you don't have to worry too much about it. This Space Cobra. So Space Cobra really lives and dies on Tasaki's like visual language and the team he's working with at Telecom or TMS at that time. Like they really go for it. I think it works in spades. There was an article I think from Peter Chung once upon a time where he talked about this was like one of the first films he saw when he was younger that was like a fan rip, right? It had no subtitles, and he just watched it, and like he was like, actually, well, you don't even need the subtitles. Like the story basically is the way it's presented, especially I think in the first half even more so, like the way it creatively cuts from thing to thing. You don't need the subtitles at all. Like it's all visually explained and seen, and even just the way it approaches small scenes in like really unique ways, I think that's what comes together. And I think the narrative, if you don't know anything about Space Cobra, you're probably going to come in like, well, who's this lady? What's going on? Who's these random people? Well, redundant, doesn't matter. Like it's all about like this sort of dreamlike atmosphere of it all. Now, Gundam's head animation director at the time was, we call him Yas, right? Yas was very talented, and I think they were kind of looking to try and maybe mold him into his own sort of director within the studio at Sunrise. You know, like they say, like, well, he could do this too, and he was also a bit of a mangaka, so there was a period where there's a lot of I say it's almost like a trilogy. Like he has a trilogy of movies in the 80s where you know, some of them based off like stuff he'd done. Crusher Joe begins that, and it's a little bit more cartoony, a little bit more silly. It also has like a television like an OVA series that goes with it, I suppose. But the movie, I think from a narrative perspective, it's probably like the most complete like story that feels like you don't really need to worry about like reading any more of it. You think you get enough information in it. It doesn't feel like an adaptation where like it's really trying to cram a lot into a small space. This kind of just works on its own, and it's really quite fun actually. I think with some of the intrigue of it is that you've got these group of people that they do sort of dodgy commission jobs, it seems, but like the beginning of the plot is like they just get like bummed over, like they lose their license and they just get drunk and they start like a bar fight. It's just kind of seen that it's just kind of like it's completely messed up. Like everything's just messed up instantly. Not even necessarily it's like super their fault, but they didn't follow some policies and then they got duped by someone else and they couldn't prove their identities. So yeah, it all comes together in that way, and I think that's a pretty fun little dynamic. But then it just spirals out into this complete like conspiracy plot, and because of that, there's a lot of like fun action set pieces. Like Yas is just really good at that, and this one in comparison to what we're going to see next, I think it really just plays into the more samey elements. Like I think they become more and more ambitious as each of them go on, and this one is more just like, yeah, we're just having fun with animation here. We're just gonna mess around. We're not gonna worry too much about how it comes together in the end. And I think that comedic aspect really gets it. Like one thing about it, Senegata from Lupin, I think the voice actor too, like it's just the antagonist, or like one of the antagonists for the sort of like more space police, we could say, right? Joe himself being like just like a really Kusugaki kid to they're all pretty young, but just like them falling into these situations. But yeah, I think the highlight when it comes to the sort of action here is that the verticality of its action set pieces. When they go to space, like a lot of also like how it transitions. Like I think one of that's definitely a factor here in terms of it kind of jumps from space to forest to the trees in a quite effective way between like it's and just how it sets up these long sequences. Now, towards the end, I think the film starts to get a bit like maybe exhausted in its own energy, but I think it all does come together, at least at the end. It plays to Yas's strengths as a director and animation director. Also, yeah, look at these punches, man. So not only was it about Nausicaa, right? Nausicaa's a success, right? This Hideo Ogata, who was the producer on Nausicaa, he sees Yas, I guess, and he's like, I think we can try this again. And so he picks up Yas and says like, you got a manga, you got many mangas. Just take one of your mangas, turn it into a movie. And they just chose Arion. They let him adapt it. And this is where things get a little bit more, I guess, ambitious, quote. Like, the first film, pretty flat, ultimately. Like, I think it was basically around more animation techniques and sort of just the cuts themselves. But here, you start to see them play a lot with scale and dynamicness. It gets a little bit more surreal. It just feels wider, probably because it's obviously widescreen too, and just the sort of mixed media approach, Joe. Like you might see a bit of smoke or something, but here you really start them playing with oils and sort of depth of field, scale, the way it uses compositing in terms of like weird surreal effects with oil drum sort of stuff, blurs as well to sort of. Sometimes I think it's to be cinematic, but other times I think it might be just to sort of block the quality of the animation, maybe not being amazing. Even if at times you can tell the ambition maybe is a little too high, they have to like fill in some parts with some stills, especially towards like the great battles. This is like a classic Greek tragedy, like a Jason the Argonauts kind of thing. And it's very ambitious, maybe a little too ambitious. It's probably the most ambitious of the three in terms of what it's trying to cover. It's really giant story. I had to look it up because I was trying to figure out like, all right, is that a real myth? And in sort of like Greek myth story, a lot of it comes that he may have been the son of Poseidon. He was rescued by some dolphins. It's that classic story. There are no dolphins in this film. That's the one biggest critique I have of it. But I think it's a really mesmerizing sometimes story about a boy taken away from his mother by Hades, and then he just goes out and murders all the gods. Like he just goes off on one. I'd say out of the three of them, the Venus story might be the best. This is like definitely the one that does the most crazy animation set pieces. Like when they go, they go. Venus Wars has this sort of kind of issue in terms of like it tries to establish a lot of characters and it almost feels a little bit like Akira at times, but only really aesthetically. I think actually the whole plot is very different and the way it sort of it goes completely different. But I mean, it does have the motorcycles and the group of ruffians. But yeah, like it definitely feels like there might be elements of the story that had to be removed for time because it's a pretty long film already, and it feels like they're basically taking like this whole volume of events and trying to turn it into a movie. But when the film just starts going, when the the oppression of the regime happens, and you just get into the sort of like no nonsense protagonist who is just not having any of it, like you get some insane stuff that's just great, like running away from the police, amazing, like taking out tanks, just like these absolute mad lads just going for it. Just some of them, even the things that don't necessarily work sometimes, like there's some live action sequences they draw on top of, really interesting to see, though I feel like there's some things about like how the footage doesn't really match as much. It might be something to do with the shadows, or that the footage itself feels like it might have needed a layer of sort of abstraction or something to make it feel like it's there together. Maybe they didn't have enough time to even like maybe they plan to like paint over the live action footage a little bit just to sort of make it match a little bit better. But still, it I think I just appreciate they tried it, and it does sort of go back to what we've seen in a couple of those last films. It's just kind of a rarity because like, Yas basically just stopped making films after this pretty much until basically this year. So yeah, maybe like 40 years, right? He just disappears into the ether. He's just like, nah, I wasn't happy, I'm out. That's usually what the story you hear. It might be a rumor, I don't know. But there's been a couple releases in America since. I haven't seen any in my side of the pool, but if you can get a hand on it, I've heard the newest version's pretty cool in terms of, I think they have a new dub coming out for it, new translations. There's a very recent version apparently. But like, it is generally a very beautiful film, and like, you can't be Yas when it comes to this stuff. Like, you can't be Yas when it comes to a chase scene. Also, just the scale too. The scale, and it does definitely give that sort of like dense, grimy sci-fi world, almost a little bit towards World War II homaging as well. But just especially the way they're painted. I think there's something about the art direction of these movies as well. They use a lot of strong blacks, so, and a little bit of abstraction to kind of give it just a sort of its own energy. Slow, meditative, a lot of crossfades, very strong sort of dark art design. Just, I mean, you could say like the tone maybe a little bit dark at time, but it really is just like it's a very specific aesthetic and quietness. The film really breeds in that sort of in between, the abstraction of almost the dreamlike rail experience. Yeah, it doesn't sugarcoat the story. It seems like, this is for essentially a story for kids, but like the content is very mature, doesn't really explain it, and kind of has a lot of it being left up to interpretation, but also at times can be very surreal in its visuals. When you're in the first bit of the story, everything's quite still and set, and like the town itself is set up in a very specific way. It's all very grounded. But then when you get to the train, like the rules are out the window, and it almost becomes like fragmented little tales. Like I said, Toei, mostly at this period, their movies have just went straight into just franchise stuff. And the biggest franchise, or one of them from them during this period, is going to be Dragon Ball. In rewatching it, I have seen it many times in my youth, but the Dead Zone, very fascinating. I will refer you to Jaden Cineclinic's video on the topic, especially. I think he made a whole video, and I think he made some really good points about how this is kind of like the transition point between the sort of mysticism and martial arts of the original series and the more sci-fi, strict action energy that you're going to get in Dragon Ball Z. So this is kind of like, this is almost like a buffer point, and the world of the film is pretty unique and interesting, like visually. That you spend some time on Kami's lookout, but it's not quite as it is. How it connects to this this ancient story of vengeance on Kami's side, I think that is also helpful. You may be familiar with a lot of the cuts here because they were used in the original Dragon Ball Z opening for the West, if that be like the Funimation version, right, with Dragon Ball Z. So you've probably seen a lot of the coolest cuts, and have been always. If you've never seen it, you might wonder, like, Where are those from? What is that? What's happening on the screen right now? I don't remember that part in the series. Well, it's because it's from here. And it still has the humor too. I think that's fun. It's in that kind of still playing between the sort of more broadly comedic elements. All right, the 90s. Oh, 90s kid over here. Right, well, there just happened to be something called the market crash in Japan. So you might see there's maybe a little difference to what happened with 90s movies in that I think because of that crash, there was just less screenlighting happening for stuff that wasn't like a lot of basically franchise films. But despite that, I'm going to try and go through a list of things which are less so like that. At the beginning, we're going to talk a little bit about the more unique and weird 90s films that may have been lost in the ether a little bit. Some of them not so much, some Rojin C. Now obviously when you've got Otomo's name on something, especially post Akira, this is coming out just as like he's really blowing up in like the rental market overseas as well. So like you can do no wrong. I mean, this is just one of his manga adaptations and the director is slightly different, but he's probably got some credits in there. You throw your name on there, you get to make a movie. That's just how this goes. And Rojin C is not like Akira. Like it's a funner story about old people and a sentient sort of robot chair chase kind of situation and a nurse. Like it's just pretty wacky. It's definitely on that more sort of goofy side of Otomo's stories, maybe more like satirical political commentary too. But it's a fun time. So I want to say it's a fun time with a cast of characters you wouldn't usually see. A lot of old people just messing around and just just a horrible situations because of this sentient chair and the sort of weird politics behind it in terms of how we care for the elderly. All right, if we're going to keep going this memories, all right, I'm gonna have to go like a speed run of fucking like Otomo's side project people, right? Memories. Well, one of those is Otomo, but again, he's using that Akira credit to sort of have these another anthology movie similar to Neo Tokyo. We've got 3 different directors, 3 different shorts, and starting with one that's probably well known for having the script written by Satoshi Kon. And it kind of came in a situation where Otomo was trying to get another one of his animators to get into directing as well. So together, you get Magnetic Rose. Magnetic Rose is usually the fan favorite of the 3. And then another sort of like silly and saccharine story with the second one with Stink Bomb. In terms of like corporate politics, culture, and just like the goofiness of Otomo. That one came from Madhouse co-production. I think a lot of the story in itself, similar to Rojin C, if you like that kind of thing, it has a sort of energy to it and a sort of lightness that I think is a nice change of pace after Magnetic Rose. Finally, you get his short, which is basically one of the craziest like pan shots in anime. It's very mastercrafty. It's like basically just Otomo flexing, but I've already talked about these I think twice before. God, probably in the Satoshi Kon video, 4C month. I think 4C did some great production on this. Check him out if they sounds like it's up your alley. Next one, Spriggan. Now Spriggan is kind of a mess, but a beautiful mess in terms of like it is just absolutely animation powerhouse, strange adaptation period. Kind of before that period where like there becomes like an era where like the idea of adapting a manga into something becomes like, no, we have to keep really strictly to it. Where this is just like, nah, just find a story in the middle of the manga and we're going to do that and we'll figure it out. We'll probably add some bits and pieces and we'll make it work. And Spriggan really best known for having some amazing set pieces, just next level stuff from the director in terms of what they did there. I don't think you're going to match it. There's definitely some cool art design later. It gets a little crazy, wacky, if you're into this style of like realist anime approaches. And even if you're a Spriggan fan too, I think, well, I'd hope in retrospect after the series, you now have maybe what would be considered a more accurate adaptation of the source material through Netflix. But this is something that I think stands on its own, even if it feels a little bit like the animation set pieces rule it and everything else is kind of secondary. But God, they're pretty good. All right, so here's another one for the realists out there. Run Melos. So Run Melos, again, kind of like, I think it was Osamu Dazai story, but it's based in sort of like Greece era time. Kind of a story of like an emperor sort of abusing his rights against a simple farm boy. And again, this is realist anime era. I think they had tried to turn this into an adaptation once in the 80s. I've never seen the 80s version, but the 90s one works pretty nice. I think the way they approach the animation is a way that really fits the story. Sometimes they get a bit more surreal with the visual quality of it, but just stuff like the horses, the running, it is such a kind of small story blown out of proportion that I think that they keep it quite naturalistic and sort of grounded in the animation. I think that helps because it will get really like outlandish towards the end. Some of the actions as well, when there isn't too much, but when you get to like the sword fights, I think that's where this style really comes into its own, because you get to see maybe what you'd expect a sort of like awkward sword fight in the woods to look like. As a Greek tale, sort of at first it captures the life of the city very well. His approach to character animation too, being both slow but also sometimes exaggerated in fun ways. That grounded nature of it really helps sell the finale of the story, which ultimately this is a story about perseverance in the face of death. Before we go head first into all the franchise films, let's talk a little bit about Whisper of the Heart. It's an adaptation of manga, a pretty loose one, but it comes from Yoshifumi Kondo, obviously at one time considered the right hand of Miyazaki. This is his direct debut. Unfortunately, he never got to make another film because of tragedies beyond himself, but it kind of I guess it's unfortunate because it shows what could have been, because Kondo's work here was really good, like especially the team that he worked with as well. Like it was a lot of Telecom as well and Ghibli, but they came together, and I think it makes something distinct from the other two voices at Ghibli, and that like this is, while it is like a little bit more slice of life, it does sort of do this magical realism stuff in terms of how it interpret, like how the characters sort of interpret these sort of more fantastical settings, the way it has its sort of philosophy on being a creative as well, and the romance I think builds out quite nicely. It begins a little bit, as these stories go, like a little bit like rough around the edges, but ultimately I think it becomes very sweet towards the end and has some just the violence scene just and also when it does get into the fantastical stuff, it does it in a really unique way. They got specific painters in here just to sort of give it a unique flair, like because we've seen a lot of fantasy settings from Ghibli, right? And I think this one really stands out because of the extra people they got on and the way it looks in such a way that I don't even know if at that time it would have been possible to make the whole film look like that. This translates to, was it like the clouds, like the wind. Now it looks like Ghibli, that's because of the art director and animation director, but it's actually Pero. And there's some really good action animation towards the end. What really sells, I think, it's the main protagonist, Ginga, just in that it's a kind of very unorthodox story of like a girl who basically on a whim decides that she's going to marry the emperor just because, then she could sit around and eat and sleep all day. And then like kind of coming to terms of, oh, actually, maybe there's more to life than that. Maybe there's more purpose in these sort of situations. But doing that through like learning about the world, she gets an education. She eventually ends up falling into like political revolution, I suppose you could say. A lot of like that side. The first half of the film is mainly just very fun, sort of character interactions, fish out of water stuff. But yeah, it starts to get a little heavier towards the end. And yeah, I think it's just really engrossing. It could have easily been a Ghibli feature, I'm sure. Alright, on to the franchises. Pokemon, there was a movie, but movie schmovie. I want to watch the short at the beginning. Pikachu Summer Vacation. That's the good stuff right there. Even like the English dub, actually, because the English dub has slightly different musical tracks, and they are bop. It's kind of more like a Warner Brothers short. There's a lot of comedic sort of slapstick, but still kind of the saccharine that Pokemon is known for. Really, really comfy watching. They actually made some follow-ups, I think, on called like the Winter Vacation, but I think they really hit it here. If you want to watch the rest of the movie after that, that's up to you basically. But that's what I'm going to say right there. This is a keynote Pokemon I'm looking for, because you usually don't get to see the Pokemon just do their thing as much. So it's kind of interesting to see them just on their own, no trainers, just Pokemon interacting with Pokemon and seeing how they do stuff. Ghost Sweeper, was it Mikami? Look, hour-long film, fun kind of dive into the franchise. This sort of mixture between exorcism, West meets East kind of thing. Nosferatu, but he's also a samurai warlord. Very playful. It's a good time. That's what I'm saying. Blackjack the movie. Okay, Blackjack the movie. Another Dazaki. I didn't even know this was going to be a Dazaki going into it. So, during the sort of 80s and 90s, Tezuka Productions, getting subcontractors in, they did a lot of readapting of a lot of Tezuka's stuff, but kind of like a new level of paint, going sometimes into full animation. And this is what seems to be pretty much full animation. It's kind of interesting seeing Dazaki's style, which is usually based around the limitations of the medium, in full animation. I think that's kind of, to me, a little bit of the draw. It's like, it is, if I remember right, Groundhouse Gattaca, effectively. And there's also some stuff in there which is fascinating in terms of they use like color pencil transitions too. And I think it is just that even if Dazaki doesn't need to necessarily use this limited approach, I think the style it brings to it in this format is still fascinating to see the intersection. That there's just, it becomes more like a stings of like what needs to be accentuated. That's when we go back into this sort of limited approach. It's also gnarly as hell. You're under arrest. Now on my notes it just says like pew pew cool, I think, something like that. It's widescreen, multi-shaded, almost like they got the cameras going too. There is something about it that feels more movie-esque than you perhaps than like the OVAs or television show would. But I don't know if you need to have seen the other stuff, really. I think you can kind of go into it, but I think it might help with the beginning of the movie, because the beginning of the movie is more character-based and sort of establishing some stuff between them, and then at some point the plot happens and it just goes in and it's like, whoa, okay, we're in. The thing with You're Under Arrest, a lot of I think some of the appeal of it, outside of it's like, oh, it's a strange group of colourful women cops, is the technical animation stuff, the end of an era, this is some of the height of just vehicle animation that you're going to see. And the movie doesn't have a ton of it, but when it does, it's it's really on there, especially towards the end with the helicopter car chase situations. And all the other vehicles are also really strong in the film too. And anytime the set pieces are going, it comes together nice. City Hunter. And City Hunter, you can kind of see the aesthetics of it being quite close to Miami Vice. And I think this is very Miami Vice. This feels just like an episode of Miami Vice, basically, but with just a little bit more comedy mishaps happening. And yeah, I've seen this a couple of times. I found it once upon a time, some bootleg of it, probably on YouTube, when there was an old dub of it. The dub was actually quite fun. I think the person they got to play the City Hunter in question did a really good job. But the Japanese too, I've seen both now. I think it comes together really in kind of giving you a preview of this is kind of the appeal of the show. Just here you go, bam. A very serious kind of cop drama terror situation, but now the characters in it are not the conventional ones you'd expect to be in. It's basically no breaks, all adrenaline for most of the show. The way the characters sort of end up in the situation too is quite nice, in that they kind of just all fall into the same situation quite snugly, and how those interactions go from that point works together. All right, on the cusp of the 90s, maybe this is a little bit cheating. There are two card captor soccer films. One of them I think came out in 99. I think the second one maybe 2001, 2000. The first one is an interesting sort of look in the concept of a TV animation getting a movie. Big widescreen. Specifically this one though, the way it lights the situation when they go to Hong Kong, it feels like they basically just fell into Ghost in the Shell or something realist, like a realist anime. The lighting, the approach, the exposure rates, the way the characters are shaded, the way the world is, the scale, the panorama, so much of it it feels like these characters are completely out of their element, and I think that's intentional. It's almost the backgrounds themselves completely do not match the aesthetic of what usually soccer is like. And that's kind of interesting, even though that movie's more supplementary, but there's some good stuff in there, especially in the dream sequences and a lot of the later stuff when it came into water animation. I mean, the second movie, now we're kind of getting to the 2000s, it gets so we're just breaking in, a little cheating. But this one is harder to recommend to people who don't know Sakura because it's basically the finale of the show. It finishes the sort of cliffhanger that the show ended on, and just sort of wraps up with a neat bow. Though I suppose then they made another manga over here at some time. But the original run, this is the ending of it. So it is definitely, like, I guess, essential watching for those fans. Probably a little bit closer to just being like a bigger version of the show, even in like the premise. Like it has that same structure of, like, you know, sort of like the main conflict of it is something kind of a little bit more like school kids, sort of that kind of element of that, but then something in the background starts just peeking through and it keeps getting worse and worse. So now we're in the 2000s, right? That's how this goes. 2000s is a little bit different because about late 90s we get the third boom of anime in Japan. So because of success of certain international titles, among other things, we're starting to see a lot more projects and movies, also because of the DVD boom as well. So there's a lot of booms and busts in the timeline. But because of that, there's a lot more movies going around, maybe a couple more pitches happening than there was maybe in the early 90s. But we're still going to be a little bit in the franchise area for a little bit, right? So now I'm going to be talking about Digimon the movie. Now this one's a little bit confusing because if you lived in the States or the UK or whatever, you know that there is some kind of movie that's like 3 movies stuck together, including 2 shorts by Hosoda and 1 movie that came out much later. This movie very funny, if you can find it. Like, if the Fox Kids dub is someone else, the Angela Anaconda part is horrific. The soundtrack is absurd. But mainly, if I'm going to talk about Digimon, I'm probably going to say the war game section is definitely the most interesting and fun bit, which is also from Hosoda. The bonus points, if you want to watch the short beforehand, those two, they can match quite nicely. So, like, the idea of the cyber virus taking over the world, that's a fun concept, even if you don't know what Digimon is. Though I feel the benefits of this one is probably knowing more about Digimon, because it doesn't really introduce the characters as much. It's more so about, like, here's a problem, we're going to deal with it, let's deal with it. And that sort of concept is expanded out in the interesting visual language. Speaking of which, with Hosoda, man did a lot of franchising for Toei for his early years. A lot of people quite like his One Piece movie, which is One Piece movie 6. If I'm going to talk about One Piece, though, I'm probably going to go for a more of an outsider choice with movie 1. Movie 1 is, to me, worth looking into just because it's short, funny, and to the point, and doesn't feel like it's a truncated sort of arc of the show in 90 minutes. But also it's a kind of relic in that it's one of the few pieces of One Piece history that's actually cel animated. The show, as far as I understand from the beginning, was animated digitally. So this is it just looks different, and I think that's kind of a novelty. But yeah, I think it's a fine little time. All right, so maybe this is the final little franchise one I'll talk about for a bit. We're going to talk about Digicarrot the movie. My request here would be that you go and watch the entire show first. And that's pretty easy because the original show is like 3-minute shorts and there's only so many of them. So you could get through it in an afternoon, no problem. And the movie itself is only like half an hour, but it's a nice finale to that series. As soon as you've watched the series, you're going to learn to love Digico and that world. And this is just more of the same, but on a more expanded scale. I think it actually plays with that in really fun ways too. It's a delight, and I'm going to be talking about Digicarrot actually a little bit later, probably in January. I'm going to get into that, so stay tuned. All right, now we're going to get into some of the more how did they make these films, I'm not really sure category. Let's start with Metropolis. This is probably my favorite Rintaro movie. Absolutely beautiful, color design, the scale of it. It's pretty much full animated. 150,000 drawings or something stupid like that. At the time, it sometimes quoted to be the most expensive movie made at that period of like 2001. But yeah, the story itself, I made a whole video about it once upon a time, but the way it not only visually is presented, but also like the story's sort of underarched concept about worker rebellion, it's definitely interesting to look at, especially when it is put alongside the sort of Japanese nationalism elements. I think it is a fascinating piece of work that just stands on its own. I probably prefer it than the original Metropolis, quite frankly. But definitely, actually, in some way, it has the spirit of that film. Even though it's a very... it's an adaptation that has very little to do with it. So does the source material as well. And funnily enough, it's a film, if I remember right, that Rintaro once said that he didn't even think if Otomo was still alive, he would have let him do it. So, yeah. This is one I didn't even know if I was going to put in the sort of art house category, or if I was going to put it in this category. I want more people to see it, so I'm putting it here, because since I've seen it, I'm kind of been just obsessed with it. Tree of Palm, a very loose sort of Pinocchio film from Nakamura. Nakamura was an animation great of the 80s, worked on both Nausicaa and Akira. Some might say that this film kind of feels like a merging of those two concepts. And originally, if I understand right, it was going to be a manga, which they turned into a movie. Even had its own like animation studio made for it. But it's just such a strange, dark, intricate thing. I don't even know how to explain it. There's so many layers to it in terms of like what it is going on about, you know, philosophically. We could talk about that. You could talk about psychologically, even when it turns about the relationships of its characters and how it presents a character like Palm as quite unlikable in a lot of ways. And I think that's almost intentionally so. Someone who's kind of coming to terms with the concept of what it is to be human, which is not exactly unheard of in the sci-fi genre. But yeah, the way it presents it and its world, it is effectively biting off more than it could possibly have ever chewed. But I think if you watch it and it resonates with you, I think it will resonate in a very special way, which I don't think many films can. And yes, it is strange, it is eerie. In fact, you could see the influence is definitely coming from the French side of the spectrum, if that be Mobius, or if that be films like Fantastic Planet, or even follow-ups like Time Masters. This is definitely that kind of look. And also how, in some ways, I have a hard time understanding who the exact target audience is. Allegedly, I think it's supposed to be for children, but it is a very bleak film. Like, you know, the original Pinocchio has some parts which are considered quite scary at times, maybe for kids, a little bit horrific and dark. But I remember watching that as a kid and not even blink an eye. This, I don't even know. Like, there's some gnarly stuff in here, including scenes which are like almost repulsive. But they're there for a really specific point, especially when we talk about things like abuse. This is something that's really like paramount to the film. There's this idea of abuse and relationships with like figures of like maternal figures. It's just like recurring cycles of this. I hope one day they will release it on Blu-ray and maybe we'll get some more talks, because it's a kind of movie where there hasn't been a ton of talk around it, not a huge amount of interviews. Some stuff when the film first came out, but it's been almost 20 years now, so I'm expecting, I don't know, maybe it's time to sort of re-obsess this one.
Thank goodness. No! Sing for me. Please, won't you sing for me? Xian, come on, sing for me. No!
Bloodlust. I think, God, have we even talked about Kawajiri yet? Well, you know, Kawajiri, he somewhat designs a sort of groundhouse anime aesthetic towards the 80s and 90s period with his work. To me, though, this is probably the work I think of his which is the most interesting, good. I think this is his best work. You know, this is definitely up there. You know, there was an original Vampire Hunter D from the 80s, which has its own charms, for sure. Though I feel, in some ways, this is such a different beast. Even though it is an adaptation of the same material, the way it's been adapted and changed, I think, adds to the story in some pretty good ways. For the most part, we could argue about the ending, but it's sort of in the way that it moves away from what you would expect from the genre, especially since in this situation, the vampire is actually not the antagonist, it's the one being chased, and that can kind of lead to dynamics about love and romance and all that other stuff that it kind of is trying to pile into, which I think has always been paramount to the sort of vampire's curse. But then also reflective of Diaz himself as a character. You get a little bit more insight into him as a character too. He's not necessarily just a sort of blanket shell here. This came out during like the end of the Cell era, many peak years for Madhouse. Stylistically, I don't think you could really top it for Kawajiri. This is where he was just like hitting top averages. And yeah, just the scale of it too. The world building in particular, so impressive. And I do think that Kawajiri obviously has a special place in his heart for this world. I mean, he spent a long time even trying to get more stuff done. If that be this television show that may never come out, but who knows. But just that factor of it to me, you could definitely tell this is something he's very intricately interested in with his group of talent here. All right, Princess Arete, I think you say, or something like that. It's a Greek word. I forget the exact one, but based on sort of like feminist novel from Britain of all places, but it had a pretty strong relationship in Japan with the Japanese feminist movement. But alongside that, many years later, you eventually get an adaptation from Studio 4C, and it is an incredibly unique adaptation. I think the way it handles the sort of princess narrative is probably just one of the best I've ever seen in that. It's really hard to see if there's something like Arete. I mean, it has a quite slow, methodical style to it, and even the aesthetic of the film feels like it's from a far gone era, like far before when it is. But it's also Katabuchi's movie directorial debut, and they themselves, along with their wife, who tends to be their animation director, they've just worked on a lot of very interesting stuff. Generally, I've really enjoyed all the movies they've done. So this is just a really fantastic debut. Millennium Actress. Now, usually I'd put Con in like a classic category. I mean, I've already made a whole video on him too, but I think Millennium Actress, because of how it was made, unfortunately might have gotten the short stick in terms of a lot of his other work, especially when it came out, because it was sort of came out as part of a DreamWorks thing, where they were thinking about getting into anime movies more on distribution, but they just kind of left it out in the in the rain, effectively. And I think because of that, it's a movie that didn't get as much play as his other movies in the West. Nowadays, you can finally buy it again. I think it took the longest time for it to even get like a full release in England. But yeah, now it's actually much easier to get hold of than it has been in the past. It's probably his most sort of unconventional movie, though it plays with a lot of his standard narratives. It's kind of like his version of Slaughterhouse 5, I believe. But yeah, just like playing with time and location and setting, this was basically like the perfect formation for him as a narrative. But it is very emotionally exhausting by the end. Attack on Kinkri, I mean, I suppose a quick way of putting it would be like it has the kind of punk feeling or energy that you might have seen in Akira from the 80s, but in the 2000s. Things have moved across. We've seen a lot more mixing of newer techniques, digital, CGI and composites, as well as having some really stark art direction and color palettes which are much more bright and airy, you could say. It's a very interesting adaptation of work, specifically from the author of stuff like Ping Pong, right? Also that it came from an American director is pretty unique for an anime movie, but I think that Michael Ayers does a great job with everyone else. It's a movie that really is painstakingly built on its sort of city design and world, and is also maybe about gentrification. It's funny I bring up Akira because, Otomo actually did do, you could say, his Akira 2 or follow-up around the same time. It's pretty infamous for being a film that was a little polarizing and also didn't do as well as they expected at the cinemas, because it was at that time at least bragged to be the biggest animated movie or like just ever, with maybe like roughly $20 million, 180,000 drawings or something silly like that for a 2-hour picture. Now, this film, though, isn't Akira 2. It doesn't really play to like where Otomo, what he's expected of as a creator. It's much closer to a sort of family picture, and even within the way it is being promoted, and even on the covers, this isn't The Rocketeer either. There's actually very little jetpack play here, which I was kind of hoping for a bit more jetpack, because that stuff is cool as hell. But, it is what it is. Yeah, it's a much more slower, dense piece that only seems to be about the dangers of automation, which is very funny, but like it's blatantly in the text. Like, it is a kids' film. They're spelling this out to the audience right directly to you as we talk, that, the idea of scientific creatures like these without a philosophy, without something behind them, will only be a benefit to the backers and the capitalists, said in writing. And you can kind of see within the credits of this film, they had much more aspirations of turning this into like a complete franchise. Like, there's enough ideas there for a whole nother film, like this idea of, like almost like World War II, but with, people with rocket packs on and stuff like that. Yeah, that could have been a very interesting thing if it ever happened. But yeah, unfortunately, Steam Boy was not successful. And I can kind of see why. It was definitely not what I would consider a family blockbuster. And it didn't even get that much play to have the potential to find that audience. I think it had a very limited release when it got to the stateside. I don't know exactly how the DVDs did, but I can't help but admire it because it is a little bit messy. It does feel like a film that was in development for 10 years. Like, there are some elements where I could see like, yeah, maybe we don't need this part. Maybe this starts a little bit slow if you're going to make it for like a family. It doesn't have that sort of, I don't know, the candor, I guess, of a Miyazaki movie where like the energy and playfulness usually pulls you through the more heady concepts. like an insane technical piece, especially when we're talking about revolutionizing stuff. The way this film uses CGI effectively sets a template of pretty much the modern landscape now, how we adjust and move things in terms of planes and perspective, and how we use it for technical objects, and how you put all that in one shot. It's all here. So let's go back to Katabuchi for a second. Now, he didn't just make one movie during this period. He actually got interested in working with Maruyama of Madhouse fame. And those two continue to work together, I think, until this day, at least. I mean, they certainly have had strong connections for the next couple of films. But I think he obviously saw something in him, and they made My Miracle, which is definitely a film that I think it's very lucky he got made. It's not that hard now, at least in England. Like, there's like a release in England, and it's also like you can get it you can even rent it on YouTube and stuff. But it's not a film I've really heard much about anywhere, and it's probably because it's not particularly a fancy premise. It's effectively, two young girls kind of living their life in the past and sort of just growing up a little bit. Like, there's nothing like crazy wild that happens in the story. It's not even like in Totoro, right? There are magical creatures here. Not so much. Just kids enjoying youth for the most part and doing funny things like getting drunk off weird alcoholic chocolate. That's definitely a highlight. But it does sort of play towards Katabuchi being very meticulous about researching and specifically crafting a period of time, which we'll see when we eventually get to his next movie, I'm sure. Nasu in Andalusia, I believe. This is an interesting one because it comes from Kitara Kosaka, once known as a bit of a slacker in the world of Miyazaki movies. He's worked with a lot of them, eventually came up to be like in one of those pretty high up animation director positions. After they finished Mononoke, he was given a copy of this manga by Miyazaki while they were biking, and was like, yeah, maybe you'd like to make this into a movie. And it's probably, at least to me, my favorite cycling anime thing. I think it captures that sort of element very well. It also has that competitive angle, which is kind of interesting, that it's into it being like a full-on tournament, that it also then has a cultural backdrop of Andalusia and them trying to present Andalusian culture and this one particular character's sort of story in the midst of a very full-on cycle tournament, where the tone usually balances quite nicely between being pretty goofy in the race but also having some sort of more background serious stuff in terms of that character's personal relationships. But that all comes together real nice for a 45-minute film. Now, I was kind of hoping it'd be a little bit longer, if anything, but it pretty much fits all the source material I had into that. And then later on, a couple of years later, there is a follow-up OVA, which has another little story in it, which is also great. They're a great double feature, basically. Sword of the Stranger, known probably quite well for its final scene being like a crazy action set piece. This is a samurai film classic kind of setup, but you totally should watch the rest of the film as well. Bones doing their thing, basically. I let the video speak for itself. Now, yeah, speaking of samurai stuff, I don't tend to hear this film in particular get much talked about, and I think maybe I know why. It's kind of funny though, because you put Oshi's tag on something, usually it gets a little bit of play. But this is Miyamoto Musashi, which is about the life of the actual mythic samurai himself, but it kind of takes a more like, I don't know, it was like archaeological, documentarian sort of approach at times. Some really great action scenes in it, but it also feels a bit like a shitpost in the way it's presented sometimes, going off on like funny tangents, doing weird bits, talking about stuff that's not even related to the concept, but also trying to give you a concept that like this person has sort of basically existed through mythologizing for the longest time. We actually don't physically have a ton of info on them as a person outside of what we are told through whispers. What we do have then is some of their writing, and then going into a lot of stuff about the philosophy of how they approach stuff. I think it's cool. Not that long. Also production IG, obviously they're usually pretty solid, so give it a go. Dead Leaves. So this is Imaishi's first, I think, directorial movie credit. A lot of the gang from Gainax are with him, and they're kind of just gone wild, again at production IG, just doing their thing, going anachronistically crazy, and playing around with the limits of what they can get away with. And if you are into Imaishi stuff, I think it's totally something you should check out. All right, now I need to speed up because now we're in the 2010s. 2010, there might be like 1,000 movies come out. I have not seen that many films from the 2010s. I'm sorry. There's just too many of them. I've watched a couple, so I'm going to kind of like just fast forward for a couple of them and get on with it because I feel like this video is going to take way too long if I don't. I need to get it out before a certain time. Let's just go on through. Do you want more Trigun? Well, here's more Trigun. Simple as that. Trigun got quite popular in the States. I guess they decided, hey, let's just do a movie. I mean, I know it's been like 10 plus years, but the hell of it. Maybe it doesn't matter. Let's just do a film that feels like a couple more episodes of the show. If you're a fan of Trigun, this is definitely, it's fun to see. It's like nothing ever changed. Up on Poppy Hill, I would say it's the best from Goro. I think it captures something particular that he likes to do in his work. I talked about it, I think, once upon a time, but yeah, I don't think he did much better than this one. A lot of people trying to credit Miyazaki for it, but Miyazaki didn't actually have a ton to do with it. I think there's some boarding he helped with, some minor things, but he was kept out of the story room effectively. So this is not just his dad helped him out. No, I think this is showing that, if you give Goro a chance, I think he does have the chops there with the team he's working with. Obviously, I've got to put a lot of that on the back of them as well, because we're working with a ton of veterans here. And in some ways, it kind of makes me feel a little bit nostalgic towards like, maybe it would have been cool if Goro did actually do more 2D work. But I get he wants to do his own thing, so it is what it is. But, we've always got Up on Poppy Hill. The Goemon movie short, whatever you want to call it, from Lupin. That one, really, I think you're not going to find many other like samurai flicks that go that hard. So, and there's a Lupin picture of all things. But yeah, if you like Koike especially, and what that brand of chaos involves, there's no reason not to check this one out. Oko's in. I told you we'd come back to Katara Kosaka. Again, it sounds like it would be unremarkable. It's about a 10-year-old girl running an inn. There's some supernatural elements when it comes to more ghost elements, but it's actually a little bit more about dealing with trauma, dealing with this concept that's a little hard to sort of break to children, I guess, in some ways, but that sort of idea about when we talk about culture and responsibility and inheriting a workplace and that sort of stuff. I think that's a very specifically Japanese thing. Like, with the inn, the inn one day, because of the age of the people working it and the aging population, will not have people to run it unless Oko, a 10-year-old girl, starts thinking about becoming her career. And without her parents, entirely possible for her to go off, but she would be effectively ending that lineage, and that is an interesting thing to talk about. Though the film takes it in a more candid way that, like, Oko seems quite dedicated to, like, no, I'm quite like doing the inn. I'm going to do this. I think I can do this. But yeah, I think it's a great little character piece. Perfect ending. All right. So Dragon Ball Broly. I've seen a lot of other Dragon Ball movies I like and I've enjoyed, but I got to see this one with some friends at the cinema, and it was pretty hype and fun, and the music especially, yeah. Mwah. And I saw a bunch of people chanting Broly, which I thought was pretty funny. Definitely one of the heights of like Dragon Ball animation. Like, they really went crazy this. I'm a big fan of the new direction of the character designs. There's going to be a more interesting future for Dragon Ball than I could have expected. Children of the Sea. Now that was another one of those movies I'm like, I don't know how the hell they made that. Probably a lot of crunch, but it is just such a uniquely jaw-dropping experience when it comes to its animation, boarding and style, and the way it adapts its material. It's particularly very impressive. They had a lot to condense into a 2-hour movie and do a very good job of picking what should be in there and how they approach the material. All right, I'm just going to fast forward through these next couple picks. Just finish this section and get on. This is the real reason I wanted to do this list. I'm trapping you in the art house section, and art house is a pretty vague term, but it's stuff that tends to be a little bit more of its own quality, a little bit strange. Maybe doesn't follow the traditional expectations. All right, so we're going to start with Angel's Egg, and that's a little bit of cheating. Usually it's considered an OVA, but Angel's Egg actually had several screenings all over the world, especially in the later years. The only way you're usually going to find it now in the West, specifically, is through a random screening somewhere, which will be in a movie theatre, and they happen bi-regularly, if you can find one. And another interesting tidbit about it is that it once was actually used as the footage of another film, which has been released, especially in England. Funny enough, it got like a little release of this strange work that happened to use it as B-roll, which has its own history. But yeah, I think it's hard to talk about these sort of things, like especially art house animation, without mentioning Angel's Egg's weird place in it, especially since it's gotten so popular over the last several years. And a lot of it, I think, sometimes comes from them people trying to decipher what it's about. But only, I think that's not really the point of film. It's not really a film with... There ain't a puzzle piece, you're not supposed to figure out. There is no figuring it out. I think part of that mystery is the experience, and it's hard to really get past that. But when it comes to a dark, strange dream, you probably don't get closer to that experience in Angel's Egg. Right, now we'll talk about Mind Game from Yuasa. I think this might be the first time I've introduced Yuasa properly, I suppose. He's definitely a character. A lot of his stuff feels basically like freehand drawing. A doodle book became alive, and I think Mind Game is kind of that in the most unfiltered way. It was actually a film I believe that he kind of saw as okay, maybe that's where I went too far. The film won all his awards, sure. Not many people got to see it because of its strangeness. I think eventually they crowdfunded a version to be on Blu-ray, so now you at least can get it now. I think nowadays you can find a copy of it, not too bad. But yeah, it is strange, unique adaptation of the story that really plays into just the height of colors and dance and music and art, and specifically the way it presents certain actions. I think there are very few intimate scenes that are as creative, let's say, as the ones in Mind Game. Now, when it comes to Belladonna, I don't think this is necessarily the same kind of fun. I had the privilege of seeing it in a cinema once upon a time. First time I saw it, I think was a terrible old rip of Lasercut. This was the kind of film that you don't expect to get a new release. Eventually, it did get a restoration. I got to see it in the cinema, and it was a riot to see people react to it, because it's a very camp movie. A lot of very silly things happening, but also it's quite... It's kind of its own interpretation of the Salem witch trials, but it's sort of deeply feminist kind of picture in a lot of ways in terms of how it approaches that subject matter. And it was part of this Anirama trilogy. We could have probably put the other two on here, maybe. I guess it's up to your discretion. I mean, the first one I think is definitely more interesting than the second one, but out of all the three, I think that Belladonna stands far ahead in its musical and artistic standards. Especially I remember when seeing it, it really pushes that limited animation idea to the fullest, sometimes just pulling decorative art to the corners, almost defined in some ways the sort of landscape of what shoujo would become. This is a very different 1001 from The Mind of Amuro. Probably most known for his work in Final Fantasy, but here we got a team of animators coming together to make this sort of very improv to artistic reaction to an orchestra piece. Not really much of a crazy narrative or words, but it's just strictly a play on what seems to be very hand-drawn too. Especially when it comes to that sort of early 90s CGI mixing with this very strictly traditional hand-painted, maybe even watercolor-esque freehand animation, and how it all complements the music. Totally give it a go. You could probably find it on YouTube, to be honest. The Utena movie. Alright, that's a... Now, maybe you should watch the show first. I don't know. I don't think it really matters. In the end of the day, this movie is about Utena turning into a car and running away on a roadway into the future, which turns into a motorcycle. It gets crazy. Though I think it's definitely a movie, to me, that has more moving planes of animation I think I've ever seen before. it really takes advantage of how widescreen it is. A lot of beautiful wide shots in this movie, specifically because of the aspect ratio. And yeah, just things moving in the background all over the place. Some of it may start, I guess, as a summary of the show, but then it just kind of moves into its own area, especially towards the end where they're just like, nah, screw it, we're just doing whatever now. Doesn't matter. Let's just go. Like, just go off from the wall. You could say it's experiential in that way. Speaking of that kind of format, we have X, which was an adaptation from Chobits and Sakura collection Clamp. Now, I remember hearing back then, this move made fans pretty angry because it's almost incomprehensible, especially towards the beginning, as an adaptation of the work. You come into it, and if you don't know anything about X, you're just like, what the hell is going on? But I think that's part of the fun, is just like taking it as that sort of experiential roller coaster, because this is Ritaro, this is Madhouse in the 90s towards the end, and just going off on one, doing whatever they feel like, and some crazy ass visuals before this just turns into some sort of like apocalyptic Devilman ending. This is I think Tamala 2010. Yeah, we're going to what almost feels like outsider art territory in the anime sphere. Particularly, I think it's uniquely interesting in that it seems to be, I think, if I remember right, two siblings basically making this animation on their own, putting out on their own, and creating what they see to be a franchise that looks somewhere between 60s Tezuka work and 2000s sort of flash animation that you might have seen on Newgrounds or whatever else, or early internet pages. That kind of mixture. I mean, there's also some other stuff in there which is more like refined CGI, among other things, but just the way that approach is what makes this piece unique. Specifically that this isn't even done, right? They're still going. They're still making these things. Like, apparently, you go on their Twitter page, you can still see them throwing out new cuts from the new film, which God knows when that's going to come out, but whenever it does, if it's soon or not, it will still go, and there will be more of that. Glassy Ocean basically coming from a pioneer of digital animation in Japan. There's a couple other shorts he's done before here, which are definitely worth watching, though I don't know if they're technically movies, but they are also amazing. Glassy Ocean in particular, it feels like many vignettes put together, like a vignettes of dreams, but the energy is very special. The mixture of how it uses sort of like 3D and 2D, and even the aesthetic of the piece probably would remind you more of something like Tintin than it does of anything else maybe on this list. But that's just part of the atmosphere of it. And seeing these small stories almost feels like you're reading into a painting, because that very much is. Like the way this piece talks about time and how it slows down, you're almost like looking into the stories of people in the background of a painting and trying to assume the life they lived. And also the music really tells, like the collaboration between the creators here and the composer is just what makes all these pieces they've done work so well. I'm a little sad, if I'm honest, that they haven't seemed to do another thing like this in the last 20 years. I mean, I don't know who I've got to pay, but I would love to see them do more of these things where, in particular, the person that a lot of these are based on, the sort of, I guess you could say, the original creator, is more of an illustrator, so he's got like 20 years of other illustration work he could interpret this way, but I think one of the fun parts of that might just be seeing where digital animation has came from the 2000s to now, and how maybe they use new ways, new techniques and new interpretations to make this next piece. From Yamamura Animations, we've got a Kafka adaptation, which, I never thought I'd see an anime Kafka adaptation, but boy, am I glad I did, because just look at it. I don't know if I've ever seen anything look like that before. I was literally, I guess, spellbound while watching this piece. I could not look away. They have an eclectic mix of other works. In fact, I think last year they got another big movie, probably the biggest that he's worked on ever, that came out, though I don't have access to it, I'm afraid. I don't know how to even find it. This one, if you can find it, absolutely stunningly eerie piece. I would have loved to see more Kafka adaptations, if I'm honest. You know, I think that, especially they look all like this. But, you know, I don't know if that's going to happen. But just the way people merge and move in here, I don't know if it almost sounds insulting to describe it as like the animations from like the CDI version of Zelda if they moved in a very creatively, artistically hand-drawn way. But people squash and squish and move and stretch out, and they don't move in conventional manners, and I think that's what makes this piece so eerily, confusingly dark. Even if some of the techniques, to me, they sometimes feel anachronistic in terms of editing, a lot of like addictive dissolves, and some other stuff that's quite simple, but it all works really well to just tell this story. Anime Metamorphosis, when? And not that one. Like another sort of horror picture. There's like 3 adaptations of this in Japan. This one is the more charcoal, silent version from the 90s. And, you know, it feels different, definitely. It's not exactly the same as the Kafka piece, but I think it has definitely its own energy, and I think it has its own kind of unique flair in terms of that charcoal animation. It's not particularly something you usually see, and it does fit the slow undercurrent of classic horror. Spring and Chaos, another story from the author of The Galactic Railway. And this is actually about his life. I think it's more of an interpretation of it, a sort of artistic interpretation of his life. And it's pretty harrowing, if I'm honest. Just like the life he lives, in comparison to the slow nature of, you know, his prior adaptation, this one really goes fast forward and just powers through his life. There's no real point of like when things are jumping time. It doesn't really matter. And sometimes it will just jump into completely different sort of hallucination and visual sequences that really, that's where the film goes off. But ultimately it is a story that's pretty raw in that it's just about like a man who continues to fail at everything, especially his creative endeavors. He wants to do this. He drives himself to want to do this, and he just can't make it work. No one understands it. No one wants to read it. Eventually has to take over this business that he's no good at. The film basically tells you that, yeah, he dies of an illness very young, and while he wrote all these stories, or half finished them, during his lifetime he never got any sort of congratulations on it. It was only after he died that they became quite popular and beloved within Japan. A Japanese Boy Who Draws. Now this one, I guess, took me off guard. I mean, it actually gets quite emotional by the end, but it is a sort of story of a frustratedly struggling illustrator and their life story, and it's one that evolves artistically as they get older, and it moves through different styles to represent that. But really, I think that whole struggle of the way we tell stories about creatives usually tends to be like, no one believed in them, and then suddenly people understood what they were all about, and now they're successful. Where this story tells probably a more honest picture, which is, yeah, sometimes a project works out and sometimes it doesn't. Some projects might work, but it doesn't mean your follow-up will. And that, especially when it comes to someone who is a mangaka, this is the reality for most mangaka. Most mangaka don't get to live the life of a Toriyama, right? It's not just suddenly like, oh, okay, yeah, they're a billionaire now. That does not happen. And seeing someone struggle with, even if they want to stay in the artistic realm, or even like the concept of when it becomes more about profits and what is successful, have you kind of even lost the reason you began doing it in the first place? You know, most people make those decisions when they're quite young, and they're like, yeah, I enjoy drawing, I think it's a great thing to do, I wish I could do it for the rest of my life. And then you realize what that actually means, and it may really change you in a way. R-Sound, Ongaku. I don't really, it's hard for me to even talk about a piece like this, because I look at it and I go, this is what I should be doing with my life. You know, this is something when I was younger, was very into the idea of maybe doing music videos or something like that, animated music videos. Of course, I don't think they're ideal. There's definitely some problems with that sort of industry, as there are with all these creative industries. But just the idea of spending 7 years of your time doing pretty much half the work yourself, along with a bunch of other people you're working with in a very small team, very indie, very independent, mostly rotoscoping. I mean, I'm background rotoscope artist. He was very interested in doing music animation. So I look at that and go, fuck, where am I? But then the reality seeps in about like the admiration I have of people who can do some of this, because some of these jump between this sort of feeling of like kind of very standardly amateurish, sort of like, yeah, to like these sort of absolutely insane, interpretive, musical sequences of art where they really push the boundaries of what they can do, and just almost even in the story itself about being maybe about the most punk band that ever existed. Three people who don't know how to play instruments using 2 basses and a drum set just because they can. That in itself, I think, is pretty wild. Yeah, I mean, it does make me wonder about what kind of person you need to be to believe in an idea so much yourself that you're willing to put yourself 7 years of your life into something, keep that energy up, and produce it every day until it gets made, and then hope it will take up. And I think this film has definitely jumped around. There's been a lot of interviews. It still does the rounds, but I assume it made its money back. But that's just not a guarantee that most people can have. And I know from personal experience, like sometimes when I ask, like, why wouldn't I be doing that? Well, it's because my wrist is fucked too. I don't know if that's ever going to be fixed, but like just doing 2 weeks of straight animation for the finale I was making, that last project, kind of made me like, I was falling apart. Not only my hand, but just like emotionally, it's really hard to keep that up. Like, it takes a lot out of you. The thinking of just doing that for so long, you put so much of yourself into something, if you even like what you see in the end, is completely out of the blue, I think. And just having the determination to keep that, like after 11 months on one project, I was dying. Just the idea of doing it for that long, like who can possibly think of a project that they would want to do for that long? All right, now we're in the classic section. This is basically going to be my lightning round. We're going to go through as much as I can find. We'll start with Miyazaki stuff. Oh god, the cat's here. Alright, so we're going to talk about Cagliostro. This is probably the most well-known of the Lupin stuff. As to outsiders who are not in the Lupin circle, because Miyazaki directed it. Very chaotic production. Probably has more connection to the original series than people give credit to. Almost feels like a sort of a bookend to that idea of Lupin. Almost very fairy tale as well. Looking for some influences going all the way back to sort of Puss in Boots. Yeah, cool. Bonus points for the Fuma Clan, I think it's, or Fuma Conspiracy, depending on which version. That's an OVA, but very similar style of stuff. I think it's one of the best as well. Right up there. And of course, where am I going to be? We're going to talk about Miyazaki. Oh god, Miyazaki has so many bloody titles. I don't want to like spend all day talking about all the other films he's done, so we're going to speed through this. I guess, you know, when it comes to here, we're going to be talking about the 3 big ones that happened, especially towards the Western sphere, is going to be Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, and House Moon Castle. I'm probably more of a How guy than the other 2. And then my personal favourite is probably Porco Rosso. But of course, you could probably put every one of his films on there. I think everyone has their own preference when it comes to that. I've made enough other videos about Miyazaki if you really want me to get into that stuff. But if we're going through other Ghibli people, Isao Takahata is probably they're going to be best known for Grave of the Fireflies, very bleak picture. I'm probably more a fan of some of the other stuff, though, in terms of things like Only Yesterday and My Neighbor the Yamadas, and Pompoko, these more 90s affair films. Isn't that right, Kat? You should absolutely check out. I think those definitely reflect something in him that you won't see in other places. So Akira, fast bikes, cool jackets, pew 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 speed. What I'll say about Akira is they spent like 20 years in Hollywood failing to even get one out the door. So when a mangaka comes across, and this is his directorial debut in terms of theatrical length films, and he puts that out, and it might be, it's probably his best known film to this day, and he does it that way, like it's something to be said, I gotta say. What we're talking about, the film that was birthed because of Akira to some degree. Manga Video put a lot of money into the idea of making more cyberpunk things, because those were doing pretty good, the rentals for them. So you've got them being a pretty big investor on Ghost in the Shell from Oshii. And we're going to talk about Oshii, I don't know, we could go through Ghost in the Shell 1, we could go through Innocence. I guess we could talk about Pat Labor 1 and 2 movies. We could also talk about his version, of movies in terms of Urusei Yatsura 2, Beautiful Dreamer. These films tend to get a lot of play for him. These are probably his best known movies. What's sometimes interesting about them might differ, but a lot of that is in that sort of more, I guess, spacey, esoteric, philosophical way they play. And that's not necessarily all Oshii does. There's a lot of other stuff he can do, but you see that a lot. And you might see like an interesting transition towards Patlabor 2, where he brings in a different sort of color composition and a different sort of aesthetic that then becomes quite predominant in later stuff he makes, including stuff that he's not even the director of. Yeah, maybe you want to look at like Jinro there, something that he's wrote, part of a series of films or a series of franchise that he's quite connected with. Jinro being almost like the end of that sort of realist 90s era, especially when it comes to cell animation. In fact, in some ways, it sounds like they were breaking cell animation to even make the bloody thing. The limits of how many layers you can do. Maybe one of the strangest wet dreams of an anime film, End of Eva. Almost in some ways I could have put it in the art house category, but it became so popular and so formative, I guess, in the anime landscape. You know, it's not really in that category anymore. It's sort of living between those worlds of being a very popular IP, but also being quite experimental, more so than people were expecting at the time, I'm sure. And that boldness, I think, is part of the experience of End of Eva. While I'm here, I don't know if I can put in the classics. Usually I consider classics has to, you use about 10 years probably to like really cement it down, maybe at least 5, right? But I'll probably put Shin Eva in just a category here, just as a little asterisk, because I think that's my favourite of the rebuilds, and I'm really enjoying the idea of hopefully soon being able to see it in the cinema and getting that sort of perspective on it. But yeah, I think they did something pretty cool there. Let's get into the hose of the hour. So the hose of the hour is going to include, I don't know, maybe like Summer Wars, a very like expanded, more individual idea of that Digimon concept without any of a Digimon backdrop on it. That one's definitely one of my favorites. Girl Who Leapt Through Time. You could talk about Wolf Children, I guess. I mean, I'm not a huge Wolf Children guy, but I know it's very popular in terms of his films. Maybe some of his later stuff. I know his latest film, Belle, has done very well for him. I think it's probably his most successful. That also had some mixtures with him working with Cartoon Saloon, which is definitely sort of interesting relationships there. But you go for his whole career, I guess. It's pretty well known. Though of course we also have to then talk about Shinkai, the Shinkai sweep. Now I've seen one major Shinkai film, 5 centimeters per second. I remember enjoying it when I saw it many years ago. I have not seen any of his new stuff yet. I've heard good things about his newest film actually, but I haven't got around to it. But yeah, I guess I'd probably get slaughtered if I didn't mention that. I mean, man's Your Name film effectively brought in that new era of even more anime movies than possibly ever we could even imagine. So there's that. Koike, Redline, Fast Cars, Rum Rum. There you go. I don't know. I've talked about Redline before. If you know, you know. And while we're talking about hyper style, I guess we're going to get Kawajiri, or the Boomers Will Kim if I don't mention Ninja Scroll. Probably the height of his exploitation career level. Both ultra violent, grimy, and ugly in certain ways. I think if you were into that sort of era of the rental markets and other anime, like late night anime stuff, you probably already know if you're going to be a fan of Ninja Scroll or not. It's throughout the Satoshi Kon speedrun, so what, like Perfect Blue, amazing. I've already mentioned one of his Millennium Actress, but like also I think I'm getting quite into Tokyo Godfather. The more I watch Tokyo Godfather, the more I like it. Maybe that will become my favorite. Maybe it is, I don't know. And then Paprika, well, I'm not as big a fan of Paprika. I think it's still valid and definitely has some of the most ambitious visuals, especially when it comes to the dream stuff. The Animatrix, I think it's gotten it's gotten a lot of play. I think it's definitely one of the more interesting sort of West meets Japan anthology films, because The Matrix has more options than a lot of other franchises that did it after The Matrix did it. The Matrix you can basically just do anything in The Matrix, and it has more bite too, just because of the franchise being a sort of weirdly grim, like apocalyptic sci-fi film. I think there's really no stopping you. Where like, I don't know, maybe Star Wars, they would probably be like, all right, calm down a bit, chill it down, mate. And a lot of these other franchises, I don't think any of the other anthologies since, when it comes to this sort of West and East sort of mixing to do these things, were quite as successful as the Animatrix in execution. Shah's Counterattack is a story of enemies to lovers, where both of them still blame each other for killing a certain special someone. It's pretty saucy. And finally, the one that you've been waiting for. It's your pick, viewer. It's where's my finger going? Yeah, right here. All right, so it's your pick. Your favorite movie, your favorite anime movie. I specifically sliced you by not putting on this list. It is actually right in this moment in time where you're going to leave a comment in the description. You'll be like, oh God, I can't believe you specifically put my favorite anime movie right at the end, just before I was about to be angry. It's right here. Yes, I agree. It's right here. Also, I guess if that isn't 100, because I didn't actually count properly, just imagine I put another 14 Shin-chan movies at the end here, and that will probably put a square.
Do you like Daft Punk? Their early work's a little too French house for my taste, but I think in 2001, with Discovery, they come into their own, both artistically and commercially. In 2003, they released this, their best work, Interstellar 4.5. It has a clean, crisp digital aesthetic that gives the animation a boost. They've been compared to Leiji Matsumoto, but I believe Daft Punk has a much more cynical, bitter sense of humour. Their undisputed masterpiece, though, is One More Time. Not only is it about the pleasure to conformity and the joys of live performance, it's also a personal statement about the band itself. Hey, No. Excuse me, I need to go overturn some videotapes.
STEVEM was recorded in front of a live audience, supported by public donations from people such as Ashkar Rao, Buttery, Chunks, Daniel Strait, Doji, Floyd the Professional, Jay, Joven, Lloyd Miller, Fox Mulder, Odie, Paul, Stravagin, Steven's Mum, Stratos, Subsofa, Systematic, Takayuki Suzuki, Fiego Kinalia,